Welcome back to Joko Yo. People who visit Hannah Creek Swamp in Johnston County report things that they just can't explain sometimes. Cold spots on warm August nights, appearing and vanishing without wind to account for them, a feeling of dread that settles over visitors without warning, not the ordinary unease of a dark and unfamiliar place, but something more specific, more directed, as though whatever is there is aware of you. And sounds. Some people have reported men's voices, low and desperate, seeming to come from the water and the trees. Maybe some people have said a sound of the creak of rope under some weight, the specific awful sound of a hanging. Now, Johnston County has a lot of history layered into its soil, no doubt, but Hannah Creek Swamp has a particular density of it. A story so violent, so personal, so driven by grief and rage and revenge, that it is easy to understand why people still feel it lingering in that place. The story involves a Confederate lieutenant who lost everything, a band of rogue soldiers who terrorized Johnston County farms with a savagery that went beyond anything their orders permitted. A night infiltration by men in borrowed civilian clothes, a gold crucifix found around the neck of the wrong man, and a hanging, or several hangings, that happened so far outside the rules of war that history has spent 160 years trying to decide what to do with them. It's a revenge story, a war crime story, and a ghost story. It is also, it turns out, something else entirely, something that makes the whole tale stranger and more fascinating than any straightforward ghost story could be. Let's go to the swamp. To understand what happened at Hannah Creek, you have to understand what March and April of 1865 looked like in Johnston County. Sherman's army, roughly 60,000 men, battle hardened from the march to the sea, moving north through the Carolinas toward the final showdown with Confederate General Joseph Johnston, was a force operating under specific orders about civilian property. The army was permitted to forage liberally, take whatever food, livestock, fodder, anything that could feed and supply the march. It was all fair game. What was not permitted was the killing of unarmed civilians, the destruction of private homes without military justification, and personal theft, the taking of valuables from individuals rather than supplies from farms. That's a no-no. Most of Sherman's soldiers followed these rules most of the time. The Army's reputation for destruction was real, but it was primarily agricultural destruction, and it was ordered. Smokehouses were emptied, corn cribs stripped, livestock driven off. Brutal for the families who depended on those stores, no doubt, but operating within a recognizable, if grim, logic of war. But not everyone followed the rules. In the chaos of a massive army moving through the countryside with discipline stretched thin and officers unable to supervise every unit at every moment, some men took the opportunity to do things the army had explicitly forbidden. They moved ahead of the main column or fell behind it. They entered farmhouses not to requisition food but to search for jewelry, silver, or family heirlooms. They used violence where none was even warranted. They were, in the language of the time, bummers, foragers who had crossed the line from soldiers into something closer to bandits, and Johnston County got some of the worst of them. The account that has come down through local history and tradition describes a group of rogue Union soldiers operating under a man identified as Colonel Fanning, who terrorized farms and families along Johnston County's roads in the spring of 1865 with a particular savagery, not just taking food, but burning, not just foraging, but killing. Unarmed men, women. The Saunders family, prominent Johnston County Confederates whose patriarch, Colonel John Saunders Sr. and his wife, were at home when Fanning's men came through, or said to have suffered the worst of it. Both elder Saunders died, and their home was left in ruins. Confederate Lieutenant John Saunders Jr., the colonel's son, learned what had happened to his parents and made a vow. The Confederate Army, recognizing that a properly motivated officer with local knowledge and personal grievance was exactly the right tool for hunting down irregular fighters, assigned Saunders and his unit to the Johnston County area with orders to ferret out guerrillas, bandits, and the type of men who had killed his mother and father. For weeks, Saunders and his men searched. They followed rumors, they tracked reports of sightings, they rode out on leads that came to nothing. The war was already ending around them. Bentonville had been fought just weeks before. The armies were converging on Durham for the final surrender, but Saunders was not done. Then word reached him. A group of Union soldiers was holed up on a small island deep in Hannah Creek Swamp, just a few miles outside Smithfield and back behind where modern-day South Johnston High School is, hidden and armed, waiting out the end of the war in a place that most men wouldn't dare approach, a tangle of cypress and water and boggy ground that provided natural cover and natural defense. To get to them, you had to cross open water in daylight visible to any lookout post on the bank. So Saunders devised a plan. Residents of the area lent his soldiers civilian clothes, farm clothes, work clothes, the kind of plain dress that wouldn't really raise an alarm. His men left their Confederate uniforms behind, climbed into rowboats, and pushed out onto the creek in the dark, moving toward the island quietly enough that the sentries didn't sound the alarm until it was too late. By the time Fanning's men understood what was happening, they were surrounded. Saunders ordered every man searched. He searched Colonel Fanning himself, and there, around Fanning's neck, he found it, a small gold crucifix that he recognized immediately as his own mother's. The thing she had worn every day of her life, the thing she had been wearing when Fanning's men came to the Saunders farm, and what happened next happened fast. The men of the island were hanged, some accounts say on the spot, in the swamp, from the trees. Fanning was kept alive long enough to be marched back to Smithfield to the Saunders family home and the fresh graves of John Sr. and his wife. And there, above his parents' headstones, Lieutenant Saunders hanged the colonel from the oak tree that stood over the graveyard. His last sight, the story goes, was the graves of the elder Saunders. It's a perfect story. Grief, rage, justice, revenge. The crucifix as the damning proof, almost too perfect. Which is where this whole tale gets a little bit stranger. See, the Colonel Fanning in the Hannah Creek story, the man the county knew as a monster, was not a Union officer. He was a loyalist, and he was dead before the Civil War began. You see, that whole thing was a story. The real Fanning, David Fanning, was born around 1755 and raised in the part of Johnston County that is now Western Wake County, a ward of county justice near Smithfield after both his parents died when he was a child. He grew into one of the most feared men in the Revolutionary War, North Carolina, a Tory colonel who commanded Loyalist militia across 5 counties and who captured the governor of North Carolina himself from the temporary state capital of Hillsborough in a raid that still stuns historians. He was captured 14 times by Patriot forces and escaped every single time. At the war's end, he was one of the only 3 men in the entire state specifically exempted from the general pardon. North Carolina refused to forgive him. He fled to Canada, was elected to the provincial legislature, was convicted of rape, expelled, and died in 1825, buried in Nova Scotia, 40 years before the Civil War even started. So the Colonel Fanning, who terrorized Johnston County farms in 1865, cannot have been David Fanning. The dates are 80 years apart. But the story gave him that name anyway. A nameless bummer colonel became Colonel Fanning in the telling, because that name was already a county shorthand for the worst a man could do. Johnston County had suffered under a Fanning once, and when suffering came again, the name came with it. Who really knows what that man's name was? But Johnston County legends of bad people, you couldn't get any worse than Colonel Fanning. Now, here's what I think is true about the Hannah Creek story, setting aside the question of which Fanning was hanged from which tree. Something definitely terrible happened in Johnston County in the spring of 1865, no doubt about that. Farms were ransacked, people were killed. A family named Saunders suffered losses brutal enough that as some went looking for the men responsible, with enough rage to do what the law would not have sanctioned. That's true. The executions at Hannah Creek, if they happened as described, were not lawful acts. They were revenge killings, carried out by a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. That kind of violence doesn't just evaporate, it soaks into a place. The people who witnessed it, who loaned their clothes to Saunders' men, who heard what happened on the island, who watched Fanning march through Smithfield to the graveyard, and carried it in them. It passed down through families. It became a story told at the edges in the dark when someone asked what was out there in that swamp. The cold spots and the voices in the creek of rope are what a community produces when it has a story that it doesn't quite know how to tell out loud. The ghost story holds the violence at enough distance to be spoken. The ghost becomes a container for something true. Johnston County built itself back after 1865 in ways that it always has, quietly, practically, one field at a time, but man, that swamp remembers. I've been out in that swamp. It's weird. And people who go out there on the wrong kind of night say they can feel it. Well, I mean, I believe him. The real David Fanning, the Johnston County orphan who grew up to terrorize the state he was raised in, who captured a governor, who escaped captivity 14 times, who was so hated that North Carolina refused to pardon him when it pardoned everybody else, that he deserves his own episode. And as a matter of fact, he's got one in Joko Yo. The episode's titled Ric Flair and a few other devils. He might be the most remarkable person Johnston County ever produced, in the darkest possible sense of the word remarkable, that is. But that's a story for another day, another episode, and one I've already written. Today, all we know for certain is this: something happened at Hannah Creek Swamp in the spring of 1865. A family lost everything, and a son went looking for the man who took it. And the swamp, whatever it saw, it has not entirely forgotten. And that's your Yo, y'all. Be good.